Bob.
All right, thank you, Mary. Um, for those of you that don't know me, I'm the Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue, across the border, as it were, in Indiana. And somehow I got roped into this discussion, but I'm glad to do that. I've done a lot of programs in Ohio over the many years that I've been at Purdue. So let me get my presentation up and running, and let me share that. Um, and hopefully everybody now is seeing this presentation. So Aaron certainly gave us a lot to think about. Some of it is probably not surprising. We've been living through these changes in weather for quite some time, but I got to say, as an agronomist, as we think about the possibilities for the next 20 years or 30 years, in terms of what the weather is going to do and the changes in climate, I got to admit it gets a little scary. And frankly, I think one of the biggest challenges we have as corn and soybean growers is to figure out how can we manage these unpredictable extremes in weather. So I just want to share with you a few slides on the impact of this kind of variable and unpredictable weather on the decisions that we make in the spring. Um, Let me get this going. So as we think about the impacts of this variable and extreme weather on stand establishment, I want to emphasize that when I talk about stand establishment, it doesn't stop at emergence of the crop. It's a period of time that goes from planting and about the next 45 days after planting. And basically, stand establishment ends at about the time the crop reaches the sixth leaf collar stage. So generally speaking, throughout Indiana and Ohio, that's roughly a 45-day period after planting. So a pretty lengthy period for the stand establishment to occur. And certainly at the end of that period, we don't want fields that look like this with areas of the field that are nice and green and growing well, and areas of the field that were either delayed in emergence, or they're struggling because of wet feet, or they're struggling because of seedling blight. This is not what we want to see 45 days after planting. And understand that this stand establishment period from planting to roughly V6, the plant population that you have at V6 is pretty much what's going to be there at the end of the year. So when we talk about yield components of plant population, ears per plant, number of kernels per ear, and the weight per kernel, that first yield component of population is pretty well set during that first 45 days. And if conditions are not good and not favorable during those first 45 days after planting, we end up with final populations that perhaps are thinner than we want, but maybe just as importantly, populations that are uneven and poor. And when we get to V6 with a ratty looking stand that's uneven and not uniformly healthy and struggling, that struggle is going to continue for the rest of the season. So when we get out to middle of the summer or late summer, when Aaron tells us that Julys tend to be now drier than normal, this ratty stand at V6 is simply not able to tolerate those dry conditions that occur later in the summer, compared as if it were a uniform stand. So again, this stand establishment period determines population first of all, and the uniformity of that stand, which sort of defines its ability to tolerate stress later on. And obviously, all of this influences yield potential. And so when we're looking for ways to increase yields, when we're looking for the secrets of achieving high yields, we need to remember that this stand establishment period is pretty important and pretty critical to determining that final yield potential. Just never warmed up. They were hovering around 50 degrees, and they weren't germinating very fast. And then there was this surface crust that limited some of the emergence of the crop. And so we had a lot of leafing out underground. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, the final nail in the coffin was the development of seedling blight as the seed treatment began to wear off. Well, one of the points I want to show or make with this photo is that clearly you see some differences in that field relative to planter passes. And what you're looking at are two different hybrids in that field. So as we look for ways to manage this unpredictable extreme weather that we seem to be getting more and more, one of the tools we have at our disposal is to choose hybrids that are tolerant to a wide range of stresses. Early season, we're talking about good seedling vigor, genetically good seedling vigor. We're talking about the ability to tolerate cold soils better. We're talking about the ability to tolerate wet feet a little bit better. And we're looking for hybrids that tolerate stress better, because clearly in this particular example, one hybrid clearly fared through all those problems better than the other. And I dare say if the farmer had known ahead of time that there was such a difference in the early season stress tolerance among these two hybrids, he might have made a decision not to use the one hybrid. So keep that in mind. In addition to slow germination, you've heard us talk about this thing called imbibitional chilling. And this is one of these stresses that occurs when you plant corn, maybe a day or two ahead of a really sharp drop in temperatures, and where the soil temperatures also drop sharply. And the damage occurs when seeds absorb or imbibe cold soil moisture. And of course, it has to do that to kick off the germination. But when the moisture that it's imbibing is cold and it chills that tissue down, as that seed takes in the water and begins to swell, sometimes the plant tissues being cold, they just are not as elastic and they tend to rip. And that ripping of the cell tissues in the seed can cause death of the seed, or it can certainly stunt the germination process. So this is what we mean by imbibitional chilling, and it's this almost weird kind of phenomenon that is one of these things that has to be timed just right or just wrong, as it were, with the onset of the sharp drop in soil temperatures. But nevertheless, it's one of the risks during stand establishment. We already talked about the fact, and we all know that a dense surface crust can certainly hinder emergence, and this is a consequence of heavy rains after planting. And then I've already shown you the one example of emergence that is hindered by sidewall compaction and furrows being forcibly closed. Some more risks that occur during stand establishment that we see from time to time. This is an example of what we call corkscrewing and eventually leafing out underground. And it's the consequence of the mesocotyl. And of course, the mesocotyl is what connects the coleoptile, or the spike, with the seed. It's that white piece of tissue that's the part that elongates during emergence. And when that mesocotyl experiences injury from cold soils, the part that becomes injured becomes less elastic, and so it can't elongate like the rest of the mesocotyl, and so it begins to do this curlicue or corkscrewing kind of fashion below ground. And again, it's a consequence of cold soils and the injury that can be caused by that. If we get these excessive goose drowners that saturate soils for days after planting, the crop can literally just die by drowning. And then I mentioned earlier that as this fungicidal seed treatment deteriorates, and understand that most of the fungicidal seed treatments that are used today have a lifespan of maybe 2 to 3 weeks once the seed is planted, and then it just naturally begins to deteriorate. Well, at 2 or 3 weeks then, if the plants are still not at stand establishment and maybe they're still struggling, then you get all the seedling blights begin to move in. And we see this time and time again, where we get the crop planted and it just sort of sits there for 2 or 3 weeks. It doesn't do anything. It's too cold. Nothing's happening. The seed treatment is slowly wearing off. And then finally we get some warm conditions where the crop finally begins to come up, and we sort of breathe a sigh of relief, and then bam, all of a sudden seedling blight comes in and takes it out. So it's another risk that occurs when stand establishment conditions are cold in particular, but also cold and wet. And ultimately, the final risks of what happens during stand establishment times that are rough and challenging is that ultimately the stands may thin out enough that it forces you to replant. And certainly in the last couple of springs, depending on where you are in both states, there's been a lot of replanting that's gone on, more than we normally see. And so even if the crop emerges well, even if you get a good stand of corn at emergence, but in the next 45 days, if conditions aren't good and the plants become slow and uneven in their development, and you end up with fields that maybe look like this, where, again, part of the field in the background looks pretty good, but the part in the foreground, you really wouldn't wish that on anybody. This kind of problem again, is what occurs in that first 45 days. It sort of sets the stage for the rest of the season. If the seed furrows have been compacted, if there's sidewall compaction in the furrows, then sometimes that can be severe enough that it limits the growth of the nodal roots or the permanent roots to the furrow for some time. And certainly that's not good for the plant. And then in general, if soils are wet during those first 45 days, if they're cold, if there's maybe some shallow compaction due to spring tillage that was done on wet soils, all of that can lead to shallow rooting and forcing those plants to survive with roots perhaps only in the upper 6 inches. Well, then when we get to mid-season and we get the drought set in like happened this past summer, suddenly those shallow-rooted plants are so much more vulnerable to the effects of that dry weather, and just increases the odds of that drought stress having severe consequences. So I'll finish with this slide and just list maybe a few factors that I think are important for success in stand establishment. And maybe this will lead to some questions as we move on for the rest of this. I think one of the key factors, as we appear to be moving towards seasons that are more unpredictable, more extreme, I think probably one of the most important factors is patience. And I know that's easy for me to say. But I think too often in the heat of the planting moment, we're just so intent on getting this crop in the ground that we lose patience and we do things that we regret later. So I think we're going to need more and more patience over the years to come as we move towards what appears to be a more unpredictable and unreliable kind of weather conditions. While I often make fun of people like Aaron as weather forecasters, nevertheless, the short-term weather forecasts, the 6 to 10 day forecasts, even the 8 to 14, in my opinion, are reasonably good. And I think too often people don't pay attention to those short-term weather forecasts when they're making some of their decisions. And the classic example of this is when there's a cold front that's been forecast to come in the next 3 or 4 days, and it looks like it's going to be a really sharp cold front, and the odds are those soil temperatures are going to drop like a rock. It does make sense to begin slowing down your planting operation, and in particular avoid planting the day before that cold front hits, because that will reduce the risk of imbibitional chilling. And I've been in situations where afterwards, when we go out and diagnose imbibitional chilling, and then we ask the guy, well, weren't you worried about that with the weather forecast? And it turns out they hadn't even been paying attention to them. So again, pay attention to weather forecasts, particularly the short-term weather forecasts, as you make some of these planting time decisions. Clearly, if we're really dealing with fewer number of working days, which influences tillage and nitrogen applications and herbicide applications, but also planting, clearly we want to make sure that the planter itself is ready to go. And again, this probably goes without saying, but let's make sure that planters are tuned up well ahead of time. Any repairs are made, that all of the necessary adjustments are ready to go, and just be ready to plant so that you don't experience downtime in the fewer number of working days that we have. I would say that for those who are conventional tillage, there are opportunities to avoid some tillage trips that really aren't necessary. And I see this over and over and over again, where some people just seem bound and determined to beat their fields to a pulp and beat them into submission before planting. And then we get the heavy rains after planting, and we get the surface crusting. We have the compaction due to the unnecessary tillage. So again, if you're conventional tilling, I would still encourage you to look for ways to reduce the number of tillage trips that you make. And if your soils are suitable and adaptable for moving towards reduced tillage or strip tillage or pure no-till, certainly begin to look towards that. And because all of this, what it's doing is it's minimizing the risks of creating soil compaction. And I think this is one of the biggest concerns or biggest risks we face as we get into these extreme weather events with soils that never quite dry out, and they're really never fit to work. And so we create the soil compaction. And of course, soil compaction is one of these gifts that keeps on giving in terms of the effects that it has on rooting. So look for ways to minimize soil compaction. Operate the planter smartly while planting. Make sure if it's a bit on the dry side, make sure you're planting to moisture. If it's a bit on the wet side, don't plant too deep. Try to avoid smearing the sidewalls. Try to wait that extra day to start planting. And part of that leads to this next factor is try not to obsess over planting date. And by that, I mean, don't worry unnecessarily about late planting. And Aaron sort of alluded to this in some of his final comments, but honestly, we've had some late planting seasons in the last 5 years or so. And almost invariably, what we realize from those late planting years is that late planting in and of itself is not a kiss of death on yield. This past year, some of our own field scale trials were delayed because of some wet soil conditions in the spring. And again, we ended up with yields well over 200 bushel in these late planted fields that were late May, early June. And sometimes we laugh at ourselves and say, well, why do we plant in June all the time? Because we seem to be able to get good yield. So, I'm not saying we should intentionally plant that late every year, but I'm also saying let's not get too consumed with the prospects of late planting. And if that gives us a chance to wait and maybe get those soils in a little more fit conditions before we plant, we may end up paying dividends for us later on. And then I would leave you with this, that I'd say consider the use of 2x2 row starter. And I was going to have question marks placed after this, because I do have to admit that we've done a lot of starter fertilizer research in the last several years, primarily 2x2, a little bit of in-furrow. With 2x2, it is true that we do not see a yield response every time. But it's also true that when we do get a yield response, it can be as high as 15 to 20 bushels. It's hard to predict when we're going to see that starter response. But of course, the whole purpose of starter is to provide those plants with that little extra concentration of nutrients at the time those young roots are beginning to develop. And if conditions are challenging at that time, the idea being is that you give some of those roots that concentrated band of starter